flexibility. Flexibility comes in seeing the same object in different ways or having a lot of different types of ideas. It's also being flexible and adjusting the processes that we're using, the designs we're using to adapt to a new person, a new environment, or their evolution and development.
That was today's guest, Dr. Adam Galinsky. He's a professor at Columbia Business School in New York City. You're listening to The Science of Creativity, a podcast about creativity, art, and design. I'm your host, Dr. Keith Sawyer. Dr. Galinsky is a social psychologist who studies leadership and organizational behavior. Adam's latest book is called Inspire, The Universal Path for Leading Yourself and Others. In this book, he brings together 30 years of research to give practical advice for how to be a more inspiring leader. To be an effective leader, you have to be creative, but you also have to foster creativity in others. Dr. Adam Galinsky is with us today, and he's a professor at Columbia Business School. He's one of the world's leading experts on leadership and negotiation. I've invited him on this show to talk about how his research relates to creativity and his new book called Inspire. Adam, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's so great to be here.
I'd like to spend a lot of time talking about your new book. The full title is Inspire, The Universal Path for Leading Yourself and Others. So thank you so much for giving me a pre-release copy. I was able to read it before our interview. It comes out just next week. Is that right?
Actually, Tuesday, January 21st, launch date.
I know, that's so exciting. It's a fascinating book. I really learned a lot while I was reading it. To me, at first glance, it seems like it's really a leadership book. It's a book you need if you're leading a team in an organization. But right at the beginning of the book, you say it's not just about leadership. It's really about life. So yeah, talk about that. What does leadership have to do with life?
Yeah, it's a great question. And what really clued me into it was teaching the topic and having people come to me. Like a CEO told me that the principles that I had taught him had made him a better spouse. A Fortune 500 board member told me that it had turned her into a more motivating parent, right? And other people confided in me that they became a better friend and not just a better colleague. And so I think the principles of leadership are really about how it is that we motivate, right, and inspire people to reach their full potential. And I think that's what we can do every day of our lives. I've just written a piece called Parents Are Leaders, right? And it sort of says, look, what does it mean to be a leader? Well, a leader means oftentimes that you have some authority, but it also means that you're instructing, directing people towards some type of goal, and you're hoping to motivate them, coach them, give them skills, help them develop. And so we do that all the time. We do that in our marriages, we do that with our friends, and we do that with our kids. And so I think that that is really one of the foundational things. A second thing is that I coined a phrase, which is the first chapter in the book, called the leader amplification effect. And the leader amplification effect is really that all of our behavior, verbal, nonverbal, small, big, right, intended, even unintended, it gets amplified when we're in a position of leadership. And the reason why that is because there's more eyes on us. People are paying close attention to us. The basic tenet of cognitive psychology, right, is that attention, focus amplifies signals. And then when we have amplified signals, we also have intensified reactions. But we give our attention to people that we look up to. We give our attention to people that are important to us. So it's the leader amplification effect is really kind of like the important person amplification effect. And so I think, again, all these principles apply.
That sounds maybe a little bit different from being married or being a friend, but you said that your lessons and your workshops can help people be a better friend or a better boyfriend. So could you say a little bit about that? All that stuff you just said sounds more like there's an asymmetry, like you're higher in the hierarchy.
Yeah, a little bit, but I think, I also use the phrase, whenever someone's important to me, like I really care about what they think and their reactions and giving them, their attention. And so that means that we can inspire people, but we can also infuriate them. And one of the things that I've done in my research, I've asked tens of thousands of people to tell me about someone in their life that inspired them, but also someone in their life that infuriated them. And I discovered something really, really important. The first is that the inspiring person and the infuriating person are really mirror images of each other, right? As just one example would be the inspiring person is courageous, the infuriating person is cowardly, or the inspiring person sees the big picture. The infuriating person is pedantic, right? And just small-minded. Or the inspiring person elevates others, right? Versus the infuriating person diminishes others. So the first really fundamental insight from my research is that the inspiring and infuriating person are kind of mirror images of each other. They're on this enduring continuum. The second thing is that enduring continuum is made up of three universal factors that exist in everywhere in the world. And so as an example of one of those universal factors is being visionary, right? And that's seeing the big picture, right? Seeing what really matters. And so you could imagine in a relationship that your spouse could be really salty with you and you react to that and get kind of angry. And then that sort of sets up a vicious cycle. But if you were more inspiring, you might take a step back and be like, what's really going on here? What's really upsetting my spouse? Like what context condition are they in? And that sort of visionary thinking will allow you to be less reactive and more open to what that person needs in that moment. And then instead of creating a vicious cycle of infuriation, you create the opportunity to create a more virtuous cycle of inspiration.
It seems obvious to me that if your partner is infuriating, you're not going to have a very good relationship. And that infuriating is the opposite of being inspired. Yeah, I could see that. You want your boss to be a nice person. And if you're the boss, you want to be nice to your employees. So would you say what you're really talking about is kind of the truism that when you're a leader, you should sort of put yourself in the shoes of your people and that you shouldn't try to lord it over them? And yeah, so you're kind of putting yourself on a peer level. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's one way to do it. I mean, one of the things that I've studied most in my entire career is this idea of perspective taking, this unique, fundamental human, but difficult capacity to implement perspective taking. So my dissertation I started working that in 1995. So literally 30 years ago, was entitled, Perspective Taking, Debiasing Social Thought. So this capacity to really look at the world from another person's perspective. Let me just give you a recent example, which is a good one. So I have an 8-year-old and a 7-year-old sons, and my mother-in-law came to the hospital 8.5 years ago when my son was born, and she never left. She ended up living with us, and it became this unbelievable, amazing partnership. But recently, she's decided to move to Las Vegas. She is starting a relationship out there, and we're so happy that she has this new life chapter. But it's been devastatingly hard on my older son, Asher. He was so close to her. And when she went out to visit her new home, she hadn't moved yet, but just visiting out there, within like 36 hours, he became unbelievably mean to his mom, my wife, Jen, and saying that he didn't want her around her. He wouldn't do her homework if she was in the room, just being like, just pushing her away as much as possible. And it's hard not to react to that, to get angry at him or why are you being so mean to me, And again, she's the adult here, he's the kid. But again, being visionary really helps, right? It allowed us over time, not immediately, to take a step back and be like, what's going on here? Well, he's so mad at Lola for leaving. But they have such a special relationship. He can't express that rage to her because that would threaten that relationship. And so Jen is the perfect stand-in for that. And so once you have that visionary context, it starts to allow you to be less reactive, so you don't get as angry and then create that vicious cycle of anger with your child. But B, it allows you to help him start to understand his own feelings and therefore become less reactive to those feelings. And so in some ways, thinking about creativity, which is the focus here, it's really coming up with some type of creative solutions to figuring out. And part of creativity is trying different things. So, my first reaction to my son was like, you cannot talk to your mom that way, and almost getting angry at him. And that just didn't help at all. And then one day I said to him, hey, look, buddy, I know you feel mad sometimes at us, and that's okay. You can always express your anger, but the way you're doing it is not acceptable. You cannot talk to us that way any further. So we had to find it. We want to listen, but you can't treat us that way. And that really snapped him out of it. And he's been great since then. So, part of creativity is trying new things. And so I tried one approach that didn't work, and then I tried a different approach, and then it did work.
When you were talking about having to be creative or having to foster that creativity, I was thinking of teaching, of what I do in the classroom. And the teacher is absolutely a leader, but you can't just tell the students to learn. You can order them to learn something. They have to buy in, and they have to want to learn and take action to learn.
Yeah, absolutely. I think teaching is a great illustrative example of also what it means to be an inspiring leader, an inspiring parent. And, there's a core phrase that I really love from Confucius. Confucius says, "Tell me and I will forget. Show me and I may remember, but it's only when you involve me that I truly understand." And so in the classroom, we try to do exercises that are involving, that let people get, we're not just giving them information, we're helping them discover the information. And so a lot of times when I ask people around the world to tell me about a leader that infuriated them, one of the number one things that comes up is they micromanaged me. Right. And micromanaging is incredibly frustrating because it infringes on the fundamental human need for control, but it also signals the person doesn't trust you. Right? They're afraid to give you responsibility, right? And so those two aspects of it really make micromanagement so infuriating. So one of the ways that we can inspire people, but also maybe unleash their creativity, is involving them more. Right? Sometimes involving is giving them the larger context. Sometimes it's letting them make a presentation instead of us. Sometimes it's inviting them to a meeting, even if they're not going to talk, but just to listen and have that window into inside knowledge that they wouldn't have otherwise have access to.
Yeah, leadership is, I guess you could say it's educational, that you're teaching someone, you're guiding them to the knowledge, or if you're leading someone, you're guiding them to be an effective employee, I guess. And it's the same way in the classroom. The teacher can't overly structure the classroom, or the student doesn't have that opportunity to construct their own knowledge and become an active participant. So yeah, as a leader, you're not telling your people what to do, and you're not giving them information. It's not that kind of education, but you're guiding them toward a solution. Is that it?
Yeah, I think that's right. And one of the things that we have to remember, though, also is micromanaging is bad, but too little structure is also bad, right? And I always tell people, like, if you take a laissez-faire approach, right, to leading, you have made a really important choice, which is the most aggressive, dominant, bullying people are going to be at the center of attention, right? And one of the reasons why we create structure is to create not only fairness, but also give people a little bit of the tools they need to succeed. And so an infuriating leader is a micromanager. Another infuriating leader is someone who just abandons people, right? And this one, I'll go back to my kids again, but like my kids, they want some structure for doing their homework. They sometimes want me to give them the answers, right? But giving them the answers is the wrong approach, but just telling them to go do their homework in their room by themselves isn't the right approach either. It's helping them by giving them the context that's going to allow them to most flourish.
I see everything through the lens of improvisation because of my research on jazz and improvisational theater. And you're exactly right. The most effective improvisation takes place with a balance between structure and freedom. You can't have too much structure, but you can't have no structure at all, or you just have chaos. Certainly that's what I find from learning sciences research about effective teaching. Now you're saying that's the case with effective parenting. And you'd say it's the same in an organizational context, right?
Yeah, right. If you go into, let's say, a group discussion, right, if you have no rules of engagement, right, chaos can happen. And so one of the things that I've discovered, I was chair of my department for 6 years and sort of got to put some of this into practice, is a good example would be the worst meetings are the meetings with no agenda, right? Because no one knows what you're talking about or what the topic is. So an agenda is a very powerful way to set the structure for the meeting. It's kind of giving the meeting a vision. But, there could be situations, right, where as a leader, you start to dominate, right? And shut down the voices of other people, you're not being a very good exemplar or a mentor there. And one of the things I had to learn as chair was I needed to speak almost less than I normally would as a regular faculty member. And my colleague, Madube Akinola, if I was speaking too much when I was chairing a meeting, she would text me and just, basically say, let other people talk, and sometimes I would get a buzz in my pocket. I'm like, oh, okay, I'm talking too much. It was just a text from my wife or someone else, but it was still a great reminder. And that's another good example. To be inspiring, sometimes we need those things that help us, right? We could lose ourselves in the moment and start dominating the conversation. So it's nice to have someone there to help steer you back in the right, more inspiring direction.
Only yesterday, I was on a podcast and I was talking about improvisation as a model for effective leadership and organization. The podcast host asked me, give us some practical tips for what a leader can do to balance structure and improvisation. And I said, well, I can't give you an index card with 5 tips on it because it's so sensitive to context. Sometimes you need more structure. Sometimes you need less structure. And really, it takes years to figure out exactly how to do that. But what would you say if someone put you on the spot and said, tell me 2 things I can do in tomorrow's meeting?
Yeah, it's great. Well, I'll say one thing about the question that you got asked, which is I think what the practical tip is that you have to find the right balance between structure and anarchy, right? And so what that right balance is going to be is going to vary by context, and you're not going to get it right, and you're going to get it more right over time. But the key practical insight is that some balance has to be made, and you have to think about both of those things, right? Having unstructured, but also structure to a situation. I would say a couple things about what you could do in the next meeting. One would be agenda, right? So the most important thing for any meeting is their agenda, right? That really helps structure it. The second thing would be, where are you going to sit? Right? Are you going to sit at the head of the meeting? If you're a leader, then you are going to be imposing your authority, or are you going to let someone else sit, at the head of the table? And just as one example of this, I had a PhD student a few years ago who was really smart, and they would come into my office and they couldn't articulate their ideas at all. They were stammering and stuttering, and it was as if there was nothing there. And one day I had an idea. I said, let's switch seats. You sit in the professor chair, I'll sit in the student chair. Professor chair is higher. And I joke, he became like the Muhammad Ali of ideas, right? So sometimes just changing where you sit can make a big difference. Speaking of creativity, right? We know that getting into a different context, maybe having the meeting in a different room could open up people's ideas, right? So thinking about that. The third thing I'll say is it's still important to have rules. Right. And there was a show called The Shield, an Emmy Award-winning TV show called The Shield. And one day the producer, the showrunner, went into a pitch meeting of the writers where they're pitching ideas for episode. And he was very frustrated because not a single female writer pitched an idea that day. And he said, I'm going to be an inspiring leader. I'm going to go tell them, encourage them to speak up. And when he did, they laughed in his face. They said, okay, come to the next meeting and watch what happens when we do speak up. And what he realized is that when the female writers pitched ideas, they got interrupted pretty quickly. Shoot down the idea, sometimes even to try to steal the idea, right? So he put in a really simple rule into place that he said changed everything. And the rule was this. It wasn't about gender. It wasn't about women. It was a equal opportunity rule, which was when we pitch ideas, the person pitching is not to be interrupted until they're done pitching. The no interruption rule. And he said 2 things happened. First is it created greater gender equality, right? But it actually made everyone have more creative ideas because every person had the opportunity and space to really express what they wanted to before being interrupted. IDEO, one of the most creative firms in the world, this design firm, they have a simple rule during idea generation: no criticism. It's a no criticism rule. They ring a bell if you criticize an idea, because if I criticize your idea, Keith, that might not just shut down you, but it might shut down some Mary who's sitting over there because she doesn't want her idea to be criticized either. And so one of the things we have to do is we think about, agendas, where we're sitting, but what are the simple rules of engagement which are going to allow us to have the most productive conversation, the most inspiring, the most creative conversation possible.
And that's one of the ways I answered the question as well, is that if you're the leader, you're really establishing the ground rules, you're establishing the structure, but you're not actually running things during the meeting. If you establish this culture or this set of rules, like no one's going to be interrupted for 2 minutes, then you can sit back. I guess you could say your role is to make sure everyone's following those rules. So if someone interrupts during 2 minutes and you're the leader, you could jump in and say, hey, Joe, don't interrupt Mary. But if everybody's following the rules, you can just sit back and let it happen.
Absolutely. And one of the things that IDEO does is they have what, they call during brainstorming sessions, the idea facilitator. And so that person isn't like a leader in the classic sense, but they are a leader in that job. And they were on like ABC TV and the person talking about it says, I'm just really good at facilitating. So I've been put into this role, right? So you don't even have to be the person that does that. I worked with a company once, and one of the things that they did is they realized, so you've heard of the devil's advocate, but they call this person the knight. And the person that was the knight was just simply the one that makes sure the meeting was on schedule. And one of the things, this is a really great thing that, is so great for me and expanded my creative insight into how to run a good meeting, is I gave someone, another company, the same idea. Like, you can have this person, this role. So they picked a person they thought was like really well-respected, neutral person that no one would object to be in this role. But as they kept the rules, people started to get really annoyed with this person, and they kind of started to become a scapegoat. And so then they discovered, oh, wait, what we need to do is rotate that person every meeting. That makes everyone experience that role. It doesn't make one person the scapegoat. And that was so brilliant. Like, that changed my teaching. I'm like, oh my God, such a creative solution. So I always tell people it's good to have someone in that role that makes sure the meeting's running on track, that people are following the rules, but rotate that person. It makes everyone have responsibility for it. No one becomes the scapegoat. Everyone gets to experience it.
I love that idea. I think I might try that next in the classroom. So I don't lead any teams. I'm a university professor, but I'm in the classroom a lot. And it'll be a class. In my case, they're discussion-based classes where everyone's participating. So typically not more than 30 or 40 people. And what I'll do is be the facilitator. And I'm doing it because I want to engage in creative teaching. I want to foster creative learning, and you don't learn creatively if all you're doing is memorizing. So something you said really resonated with me. In a classroom, if you're standing at the front of the classroom by the blackboard, then that's putting you in this authority position. So something I like to do is, in every other class, I'll move to a different wall in the classroom or a different corner. So all the students who think they're in the back of the room, which, most students want to be in the back, suddenly they're in the front. And it does change the dynamic quite a bit.
Yeah. And, I think that's such a great idea. It fits a little bit of two different ideas, right? Like changing where you sit, but also rotating who's in charge, right? And those are very, very powerful things. One of the things that I discovered in my PhD seminar, and PhD seminars tend to be more intimate, like maybe 8 or 10 people. They're very 3-hour discussions, is that I started to make, let's say 10 students, 12 weeks, a different student leads the class with me each week. And that's giving them, again, responsibility. It's involving them, going back to the Confucius comment, and it's really giving them an opportunity to create a vision for the class. And it also helps me. It lessens my workload. And so it's very much a win-win. The dean of students here, that's how she runs her team meetings. Every week, someone else is in charge of the meeting. And so that shared responsibility is really helpful.
This conversation reminds me of your chapter 8, and the title of chapter 8 is Inspiring Architects. You say leaders are architects, and it sounds like that's what we're talking about. We're talking about, would you say, structuring the environment to make people be more creative, to be inspired?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that there's lots of different ways that we can do that. I'll give you a simple story of, again, I'm going to go back to being a parent, but I think it's such a great illustrative example. We often have, let's say, 2 employees, and they're not the same. They're not cookie cutters. They have different needs and different strengths. And so anyway, when I started, I loved taking my boys to school, but when they used to be in the same sort of Montessori classroom, so I dropped them off together. And then when they start off, when one of them's in first grade and one of them's in kindergarten, the kindergartner's on the second floor and the first graders on the third floor. So I naturally dropped the kindergartner off first. The problem is he likes to relax and have a long goodbye. But my older son, the first grader at the time, He's type A. He does not want to get to school late. He gets so frustrated. He starts screaming at his brother, hurry up, Aiden, hurry up. And then I start getting really angry at Asher, like, just be patient, Asher, and then Asher would storm upstairs, go in the classroom. So one day, about a month into school, I have an epiphany. As we're walking to school, I said, hey guys, what if we just switch the order? What if I drop Asher off first, and then Aiden and I can walk down the stairs, and I can take Aiden to school? And it changed everything, that little design change. Now Asher was getting to his classroom on time without any stress. Aiden got to have whatever goodbye he wanted with no one yelling at him. And it was so effective. 3 days after I started it, the kindergarten teacher, Aiden's teacher, spontaneously said, oh my God, it sounds like your new drop-off order is a big success. Like I didn't even talk to her about it. She just noticed it, right? And I love this example because I could get mad at Asher. Yeah, I could yell at him, just be patient. But like, I also could just change the dynamic so that I could meet Asher's needs and Aiden's needs simultaneously with just one small, tiny change. And so that's what I mean by thinking like an architect. How could I change this situation so that everyone's better off? Let's take a meeting where there's one person who always dominates and they have such a strong opinion that people sort of then kowtow to it. You could just say, hey, we're going to start to do the meeting and just make sure he doesn't talk or she doesn't talk first, right? So that person doesn't dominate. You still get to hear their ideas, but just not at the outset, right? That small design change could open up everyone to be more creative and share their thoughts.
I like it. And one of my favorite bodies of research that creativity researchers don't always focus on is space and architecture. And really excellent architecture firms are really thinking about people and people interacting in spaces. And I think we have some really exciting research about what kinds of spaces, as in, buildings, can help foster this kind of creativity and interaction. So you tell a story in your book in chapter 8 about the design of a new building at Columbia.
Yeah.
And the architects were actually, they knew this research and they were trying to encourage serendipitous interactions that could foster this sense of community. So architecture is not just a metaphor, it's literal as well. So yeah, tell us what happened with that new building.
Yeah, the new building is incredible. The best building 700 million can buy in New York City, but it's just, we opened it 2 years ago and they understood a number of different things. One is having different spaces that serve different purposes. And so in our old building, which I used to affectionately refer to as a Greyhound terminal, that's how sort of old it was, all the classrooms looked exactly the same. Right. And so there was no flexibility. And so we created different types of classrooms here for different types of activities. Right. We created big, wide open spaces, to have big events, but there's every single corner has these sort of more intimate spaces where people can find opportunities to like have more engaged conversations, if you will. Now, taking all the corner spaces and turning them into intimate conversation spaces had an additional benefit, a design benefit, which is it took away any corner office. Even the dean doesn't get a corner office. And so one of the big things is like it creates a sense of unfairness. So one of the things they did in the new building is every office was the same size. Some had better views than other ones, but they didn't vary by size. That designed fairness into the process, right? Which was really missing. So the old building, all the classrooms looked the same, but the offices were different sizes, which created all this like competition, and they took that out. But I have to tell you an incredibly funny story about something that was much worse in the new building than the old building. So the entire building was designed to increase spontaneous interactions, which would lead to new creative ideas between people. Now, in our old decrepit building, there was one oasis. It was a faculty lounge, which was designed to be nicer than anywhere else in the building. And it had a single espresso machine, a little espresso coffee machine. And it became the epicenter for faculty to interact. Even the dean would walk up 2 flights to go get coffee there because the coffee was so much better than everywhere else in the world. And I met so many of my colleagues in that space. So what did they do in the new building? They put not one, but 2 fancy coffee machines on every faculty floor. On every floor was an espresso machine, but also a cappuccino machine. The problem is no one left their floors. That was a flaw in the floor system, which is because everyone had coffee at their fingertips, no one moved around. And I went into meetings. I'm a vice dean. I went into meetings where we discussed expensive solutions to get people to interact. Bagel Fridays, providing food. And I actually suggested and actually believe this is the right solution, which is take coffee machines away from every floor and just put them in one single space. And if you do that, people will do that. Now they're like, oh, but people will freak out. And I'm like, they will for a little bit, but then they'll adapt. We still haven't done it. And we've reduced those spontaneous interactions that produce innovative ideas.
You have a funny story in that same chapter, chapter 8, about Amsterdam's airport.
Yes.
So I'm going to ask you, with your new building at Columbia, did you do this in the bathroom? So tell our listeners the story.
So yeah, Amsterdam Airport, Schiphol Airport, one of the problems that we always have is how do we get men to stop peeing on the floor? Right. And so what they discovered in Amsterdam is, to use the metaphor that what is men's rifle or their gun, it's their penis, that if we give them a target in the urinal, they'll have better aim. So they put like a little fly in, and it was very successful of reducing the amount of urine on the floor. I was actually there in 2014 when the Netherlands made the semifinals of the World Cup. And I was tragically there when they lost in that semifinal match to Argentina. But at Schiphol Airport, now they actually still had the fly, but they also had a little goal with a little ball. And if your stream hit the ball, you could push it into the net and score a goal. And I did that, and I screamed goal as I was peeing.
Right.
And it's so great. Think about creative ideas. Someone emailed me afterwards and said, I love that story of the fly. I've been trying to get my 2-year-old son or 3-year-old son potty trained. I actually started to throw Cheerios into the bowl, and then he got so excited to try to hit the Cheerios with the stream. And so that's just another, example. And I like, it goes back to my son's example, right? Which is, we could yell at people to not pee on the floor. We could punish them. We could humiliate them, or we can make it easier for them not to pee on the floor by giving them a target.
I love it. And I'm thinking of this image where you have like a little bowl of Cheerios on the toilet.
Yeah, exactly.
Just toss one in before you go.
Well, someone actually tried to create, ironically enough, they tried to create a product for this. It was called Peddlers. It was like 30 toilet targets for toddlers. You don't need to buy these. You just, buy Cheerios, right? But it's sort of funny that someone even tried to turn this into a product.
Oh, yeah. I love that story. So we're talking about architecture and design, and starting with chapter 8, there's something I noticed, and I wonder if, I assume you noticed it, but I wonder, starting in chapter 8 all the way to chapter 12, which is about diversity in leadership, a lot of your subheadings in the chapters have the word design in them. So they'll say something like designing X or designing Y, and that's 5 chapters in a row where you're talking about design, which for me has a lot to do with creativity. But in the text of your book, you never say that leadership is design. So, yeah, I was intrigued by that thread of leadership being designing. Yeah, could you say something about that?
Well, I think, the leader as architect is the metaphor that I use for design, right? And you're exactly right. Like, we can design negotiations to create more value, right? We can design group discussions to create more ideas. We can design systems to be more fair. And so, I already mentioned the no interruption rule created greater fairness in pitching. I talked about where the leader sits, right? Could design, greater ideas. One of the things I've studied the most, right, is how do we create more creative solutions in negotiation? And there's a lot of small design features that we can do that open up people's possibilities. One of the ones I talk about in the book, which is just, it's so simple, it's so straightforward, but it makes such a big difference because it opens up your negotiation opponent to possibilities, is simply offering something versus asking for something. So we could say, I want your X for my Y. Now that puts this person into the mindset they're giving up something. That makes them defensive, right? That makes them feel like they're losing something versus, hey, I'm really happy to offer you my Y for your X. now it feels like they're gaining something, right? And that little shift has a dramatic difference in how people go about the negotiation process. And I think that we can think at any level about how we're designing our processes. When we get into the mind of, I'm an architect, I'm a leader, I'm designing the environment that allows people to succeed, it dramatically changes the way that we approach any action we take in the world.
I'm seeing improvisational creativity again, and like I
Yeah,
said, that's the lens I see through. But a lot of creativity research focuses on the isolated individual and what goes on in the mind when people are being creative. But what your book is about is social creativity. I guess you could say it's interactional creativity. It's the way you relate to other people, and you're not doing that in a structured, scripted way. So it is a form of improvisational creativity, right?
Absolutely. I have a phrase in the book that I really love that I sort of came up with called different people have different needs at different times. Right. And so what it tells us is the thing that's going to motivate, one of your employees or one of your kids, right, is not going to motivate a different kid. Right. But the same is also true as what motivates your employee today. They might have a different motivation tomorrow, or what allows them to be successful today. You might need to do something different at another time. It's just sort of, I've given you tons of parenting examples, but I'll just come back to one quick one. It's like, how do you get your kids to go to sleep? Well, my son Asher, was resisting at a certain point, and I would try different things. And for about a month, we did this situation where he wanted me to start in my bedroom, pick him up upside down by his legs, by his feet, carry him to his bed, and then gently place him in the bed. And my wife thought that was a ridiculous way to take him to bed. And I was like, well, what do you care? Like, as long as it works. And then that worked for like 3 or 4 weeks. And then it stopped working. And then we had to come up with a different strategy to get him to bed. One of the things that I always say is just try different things. You don't know what's going to work with that person. But when you discover what works, it's really going to work really well, but it's not going to work forever. And you might have to do something different at another point. And so that's part of, I think, the greatest thing, this is a key tenet of creativity, which is we even use it as one of our measures of creativity is flexibility, right? Flexibility comes in seeing the same object in different ways or having a lot of different types of ideas, right? But it's also being flexible and adjusting the processes that we're using, the designs we're using to adapt to a new person, a new environment, or their evolution and development.
You talk a lot about this in chapter 12. For example, you did a study where you asked people if they've traveled abroad or if they've lived abroad. And I didn't realize this, but you said for people who had lived abroad, they score a lot higher on creativity tests. Is that right? And how does that happen?
Yeah, well, I'll take you back, and this is a great story about what I would consider to be like a creativity story, a research creativity story. So this is a good example of my dean asking me to do something I'd never done before. About 300 to 400 MBA students from Northwestern University every year for 2 weeks would go to one of 12 different countries to learn about how business is done in those countries. And the dean came to me and said, hey, I'd like you to do like a little 90-minute, 2-hour lecture that could set them all up for success on how they can communicate more effectively across cultures. Now, I've talked about leadership and I've talked about communication before, but I never really talked about cross-cultural. But we had a postdoc who was a brilliant researcher on cross-cultural communications. Actually, Will Maddox, who's at UNC, Chapel Hill. Yeah. So I asked Will to help me, and I'm a procrastinator. So the lecture is on a Wednesday. We start writing it on Monday. And it's about 7 o'clock at night. And I say to Will, I wonder if people who have more experience abroad are more creative. I said, let's do a quick study. So we sent all the students coming to the class on Wednesday, literally, I think 4 questions. We gave them a creativity task, the Dunker candle problem, which I had already used in a lot of my other research. We asked them 2 questions. Have you ever traveled abroad? If so, how long? Have you ever lived abroad? If so, how long? And we were shocked by the finding. So I had no a priori reason to think that one would be more important, but we found in this initial study that essentially travel abroad, whether you've done it or not, had no effect. And there actually seemed to be a negative effect of traveling abroad in the amount of time. But there's a huge effect that people who had lived abroad were, I think, like 50% more likely to solve the problem. And there's a strong positive correlation between the amount of time they had lived abroad and their creativity. And this was one of the most fundamental transformative moments of my research career. It led to a 20-year career, some of my most cited research, so many amazing studies that we've done. One of the studies we did is we looked at archival data of the top fashion houses in the world, right? They present in the 4 fashion capitals, Milan, Paris, London, New York. And we looked at the creative director, the most important executive in charge of design, and we analyzed their entire career history. And what we found is that when a creative director had lived abroad, and the more time they'd spent living abroad, their entire fashion house had more creative designs, right? So what's going on here? So this was a creative insight, right? Travel doesn't matter, but living abroad does. Well, we started to realize, and the amount of time lived abroad matters. It's about the depth of that experience. Well, what's going on when you have deeper experience? You understand the why of what people do. Here's another creative thing. I asked the doctoral student to look at some data we collected, longitudinal data, and he called me so excited. He said, "Oh my God, I discovered the greatest finding." I was like, "What's that?" He said, we measure their creativity at time 1 before business school and at time 2 when they were graduating. People who had dated someone from another culture were more creative. I emailed Will Maddox. He's like, "Oh yeah, I discovered that like 6 years ago in the date, and I didn't think it was that interesting." I was like, "Oh my God, it's incredibly interesting." So we ended up doing, showing that, but it wasn't friendship. It was only dating. So again, dating is more deeper. But then we discovered it's not just about dating, it's about how deep you go. We analyzed whether J1 visa holders in the United States were innovative entrepreneurs in their home countries. Did they start their own business? Did they create a new idea within their company? And we found that the deeper their connections to the United States that they formed while J1 visa holders, the more creative they were when they went back home. So it's really about the depth. But it's not just about living or dating. It's really about asking a fundamental question of why. What is it? Why do you do what you do? So you could travel abroad and get more creative benefit than if you lived abroad, if you went into that travel experience and really tried to learn about the other culture, but you wouldn't get living abroad if you just stayed with people from your own culture, right? Expatriates in Paris, just staying with, Americans. So this was a 20-year research journey of a number of amazing creative discoveries about creativity, which is when we deeply learn from a new perspective, it changes our long-term creativity.
Well, I have a traditional psychology question for you, so I know you'll have an answer ready, and it's the contrast between correlation and causation. So you have a correlation between people who've dated someone from another culture and creativity. So you can't say that the dating of the person made you more creative, because it might be that more creative people like to date people from other cultures, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. There's a fundamental, you would say, threat to the validity of our causal connection, because that would just say creative people are more creative. And so I'll say 3 things about this. The first is, in some of our early research, we try to control for as many personality variables that you could imagine that would also predict both creativity and living abroad, like openness to experience is one. And we show that the relationship still holds. 2 is we've done some studies where we can try to find, there's a very complex analysis in economics called instrumental variable analysis, which some economists claim and statisticians claim is as good as random assignment, where you take some fundamental variables that would predict your IV, but can show that it doesn't lead to your DV, and then controlling for that really makes a difference. So what we did in one of our studies for looking at leaders of organizations is we took people whose parents came from 2 different countries, right? Because you're more likely to go visit those countries or maybe live in more than one country. And we also took the GDP of their home country, because people who come from poor countries are more likely to leave those countries, right? And controlling for those factors. But the best study that I think was done, a couple different studies that have been done that have looked at this. One was they took people who everyone was going to study abroad, but some people were going to go in the fall and people were going to go in the spring. And they measured everyone's creativity in September and December. Now, everyone's going to go abroad, right? But some of the people have already gone abroad and some haven't. And they showed it was the people who had gone abroad already who were the more creative. So we're controlling for time, we're controlling for motivation. And then there was another study that was done, again, wasn't involved in with, I think it was in Australia, New Zealand, I can't remember which right now, where they randomly assigned some people who everyone was basically assigned to go work abroad, but some of them were able to and some of them weren't. And they again showed there was no difference in creativity at time 1, but there was increase in creativity at time 2 among those who had actually gone abroad. So what we can start to see is that there's a great question. Correlation doesn't equal causation, but through 20 years of research, our correlation question led people to do much better causation-related research. And I feel much more confident today than I did back then, right, that we can say that there's something about the experience abroad that's causing the increase in creativity.
That's a really impressive body of research, and thank you for explaining all those details. And I just want to say for the listeners, in the book called Inspire, all of this is only 2 pages in the book, and the rest of the book has just as much impressive research. Every 2 pages of the book has that much research in it. So I just can't imagine how you were able to do all this research, first of all, and then how you were able to take it and distill it and then organize it into these 12 chapters. You did a great job with it.
Thank you so much. Well, it is 30 years of research. I started my career as a PhD student in 1993. And, I only wrote the book. I started in 2021, right? And it was basically at that moment that I realized how all this research, actually very disparate and different, actually led to a coherent theme.
I have another meta question, I guess you could say, and it's about the word inspiration. Now, that word doesn't appear a whole lot in your book, but if you're a creativity researcher, we talk a lot about the relationship between creativity and inspiration. Your book is about inspiring, and the title is Inspire. So what's the relationship with inspiration? Are you inspiring people to have inspirations? If you're a good leader, do people have inspiration more often? Why didn't you use that word in the book?
Yeah, it's a great question. My focus was on what's the things that I do, my words, my presence, my interactions that create a certain feeling inside other people. And one of the core themes, right, of the book is that when we're a leader, right, we're always on stage, when people looked up to us, when we're important to them, right, and so our behavior has this bigger impact. So neutrality is an option. Your behavior is either going to inspire or it's going to infuriate. And so it's really important for people to think about the type of experiences that you're creating in others. Now, we can create experience in others that produce what you might call creative inspiration in a variety of different ways, right? Through our words, right? Through our presence, through how we design those environments, right? I think one thing that I think is really critical is, being visionary, right? Which is how we talk about the world. And when people have a visionary goal, and this is also true in negotiations, we talk a lot about this, is that once you have the broad goal, there's lots of different ways to reach it. And that allows for creativity, right? Once we recognize in a negotiations, right, that there's lots of different ways to achieve our underlying interests. So the key is focusing, what do you really care about? Then we can come up with creative solutions. One of the examples I give in the book is a research stimulus that we use essentially. And I've used it in probably a dozen studies, that some of the multicultural experience and creativity, some just, direct negotiations research. But it's where someone is selling their restaurant and they're asking for a certain amount of money, and there's a food company, a restaurant-owned company that's interested in buying this individual restaurant, but they can't pay what they're asking for. So there's a negative bargaining zone. There's no way to reach a deal. The person's just asking too much than the restaurant company's allotted to pay. But when you start to dig deeper into what's underlying their interest, right? And so what does the restaurant owner who's selling their place want when they want to go to culinary school and they need to have them a certain amount of money so they can afford the tuition? Well, what does the restaurant company want? Well, they want to buy the restaurant, but they're also actually looking for really amazing a manager who can help them design their menus. So now actually there's a creative solution that bridges their two interests, is pay what the restaurant company can afford to pay, but offer to send the person to culinary school and hire them to help run their upscale menu. Right. And now it's only by seeing the big picture, being visionary, that allows us to come to that creative solution.
A big theme of your book that we haven't mentioned yet is the spectrum between cooperation and competition. And you say that every negotiation, every relationship, actually, it's your previous book, but I wanted to ask about this anyway. The balance between cooperation and competition seems like a leadership skill, but it also seems like a creativity task, that you're constructing a balance between these two forces.
Absolutely. And my previous book, Friend and Foe, every chapter ended with a section called Finding the Right Balance. And you already talked about how do you find the right balance in improvisation, right? Between giving people the room to be creative, but not creating chaos, right, on stage. And I think this is the same thing with cooperation competition. If all we do is compete, we create vicious conflict. And if all we do is cooperate, we get exploited and people take advantage of us. So you have to find that right balance between conflict and exploitation so that you can, be in the best position possible, and the creative solutions can flow like wine.
Well, I'm glad this book came up, Friend and Foe, your earlier book, and it's wonderful. And, I guess it shows that this new book, Inspire, it's not your first book, and that might explain why it's so wonderfully written and organized. It was just a pleasure to read.
Yeah, I think, it's a great example of, for creativity, but for anything in life, like, we do better the more we practice, we do better when we work on it. I love Friend and Foe. My agent would tell me he's had hundreds of bestsellers. He'd say it's one of the 2 books he learned the most from. But then in writing my new book, I realized, oh my God, I'm such a better writer now. And so we learn over time to be even better at everything we do.
Well, as we close our conversation, I want to ask you a question I ask all of my guests, which is, given all of your research and all of your expertise, do you have some advice for our listeners about something concrete they could do in the next week that might enhance their creativity?
Yeah, I think, to me, it gets back to a fundamental premise of the book, which is that leaders aren't born, they're made. Right? Because I've shown there's a universal set of attributes that inspire other people, and we can learn those characteristics, and we can practice them. My wife, speaking of cross-cultural experiences, my wife lived in Japan for 2 years, where she taught English and did a homestay in Kyoto, and she loves the word Kaizen. And Kaizen is a Japanese word for continued improvement. And I think if you go through every single thing that you do, and you just ask the question, is there a way I could do this even better? Right? That's going to open up creative possibilities for you. Always live on the Kaizen side of the mountain. Always asking, how can I be improving? How can I be more inspiring tomorrow than I was today? How can I do whatever task I just did better today than I did it yesterday?
That is great advice, and I'm going to try to do that myself in the next week. Well, Professor Adam Galinsky, thank you so much for joining me on The Science of Creativity.
Thank you so much for having me. It was very creative, and I'm inspired.
Adam's research shows us how to be a better leader. I think it's going to be read by a lot of managers and executives. If you enjoyed Adam's stories in our interview, you can read a lot of the stories and many others like them in his book. It's called Inspire, The Universal Path for Leading Yourself and Others. I think the book's going to become required reading in a lot of business school courses. But it's also about how to be a better friend and a partner. I think it's for everyone, not just for managers who need to run their companies better. Ultimately, it's about how to become a better person. And I think that makes it a powerful book for all of us. Thank you for listening to The Science of Creativity. If you liked this episode, I hope you'll subscribe to the podcast, and please rate the show because that helps others like you hear about the show. Please write in the comments if you have requests or ideas for future episodes. I'll see you next time on The Science of Creativity for insights and inspiration about art, design, and invention.